Everything comes down to how we look at the world. And there are two ways, very different ways of looking at the world. And neither of the two ways are wrong. They're both right at the same time, even though they are very different. And we can talk about these two ways by saying that one way is the literal or concrete way of looking at things, where everything is straightforward and there's a direct correspondence between our categories or our symbols for what we're looking at for the world and the world itself. So there's a literal one-to-one correspondence. And the other way of looking at things is where there is no literal correspondence. So we have to make do with some kind of metaphorical correspondence, which is a whole different ball game. And in terms of science, we could equate this to the two ways of doing science, or the two ways of modelling physical processes. And the first way of modelling physical processes is in a literal way, using linear equations. And until comparatively recently, modelling the physical world in terms of linear equations was the be-all and end-all, and it was imagined up to the end of the 19th century that the scientific world was on the very point of being able to model everything in terms of literal descriptions or linear equations. And this seemed like an exciting possibility. What has happened since is that we have subsequently learned that the physical world cannot be modelled in this way, or rather only a little part of it can be, a small little bit of it. The rest of it is nonlinear. Nonlinear means that there is no preservation of proportionalities. So in the linear, we can change the formula, we can change our equations, but the essential proportionality between each term in the equation stays the same. So there's fidelity there to the original proportionalities. And that's the reason why they're useful, because they hold on to this essential proportionality. What happens in nonlinear processes is that the proportionality is completely lost, which means that any linearity is lost. Everything just gets morphed out of shape, and it can't be morphed back into shape because we've lost the thread, so to speak. Things have changed, and the rules that are governing the change have themselves changed. So it's ungrounded change, it's change which doesn't occur within a established or fixed framework. When the scientific world began to become aware of the significance of non-linearity, it was still treated as a special case. And so it was acknowledged, but kind of the implication was, yes, well, these are non-linear systems and they're kind of different. But calling the systems non-linear systems is like James Glick, I think, said, it would be like calling zoology the science of non-elephant-like creatures. which is obviously preposterous. We're assuming that everything else apart from elephants can be just lumped together in one little subcategory, some little note at the end of the chapter, that kind of a thing. We'll just quickly talk about armadillos and opossums and ferrets and crows and all the rest of the animals. If I sat here going through them, obviously it'd take a long time, so I don't know all the animals off the top of my head, and plants as well, obviously, or fungi, and other things as well, bacteria and yeast and whatever. Even though I know yeast are actually fungi, but the point is you can't fit them all onto a little note at the end of the chapter and have the rest of the book of zoology about elephants. And exactly the same is true for complex systems or nonlinear systems. The nice, predictable, understandable world, which can be described by linear equations, is like a postage stamp. A nice little postage stamp, but only a postage stamp, and there's a whole wide jungle there all around it, which can't be explained in this way. Which isn't to say that we can't model it in some kind of a way, because we can, but we can't model it in the same predictable kind of a way. Maybe modeling it is the wrong word to use, because there is no correspondence with a fixed model, but we can appreciate the gist of it. We can kind of get the hang of what's going on there. And this situation is exactly analogous to the situation not just in the scientific world, but in the world of everyday human beings, like you and me, or whoever else. The vast majority of the world is not amenable to rational thought or logical, linear, literal thought. There's no correspondence there. There is a little bit that is, tiny little postage stamp size bit that's there, and it's there all right, but it's in the midst of a vast primeval jungle, which is completely not amenable to rational understanding or analysis. And yet, we stick with what we can literally model with the rational mind. So much so do we stick with it that during the course of the day, probably on most days, we don't have any noticeable connection or encounter with the non-literal world. It's perfectly feasible and more than feasible that we can go days on end without having any appreciable contact that we'd notice with the non-rational, irrational world. The world that doesn't make sense to the thinking mind, basically. But we'd know about it if we did encounter that bigger world, because we would be aware of it as not fitting in to our categories. And when some element of our experience doesn't fit into our categories, it feels very, very strange and spooky, kind of. It feels odd. And we know about that because it's like it's such a different flavour to our normal existence, where things aren't odd but kind of just regular or normal, and so it's kind of definitely really weird. It's kind of surreal, and we might like it in little doses and be interested in it, but if it gets too much, it freaks us out, because it is a different ball game altogether, and we can't navigate in it using that thinking mind. So we have this exactly the same situation, where we're afraid of the greater reality and refuse to acknowledge it, and completely obsessed with this tiny reality which is there, but it's insignificant in comparison to the other reality. So we have this very same situation going on. And the point that I'm coming to is that this is also true in psychology or therapy, that we're all very, very logical. And it is in fact the case that if I do study psychology and then go on to become a clinical psychologist with even more study, it's kind of like I've got my rational hat on even more than ever before. I'm super rational, as if the requirements of this job, this professional role, require extreme rationality, absolutely clinical, absolute rationality, very serious rationality, as if this is the man for the job. And this is obviously really bizarre, because what's going on here? We know that the majority of the psyche, almost all of the psyche, just like almost all of the material universe, is not a logical affair. It's not a linear, sequential cause and effect affair that we can understand. It's something that we can't understand at all. It's a complex jungle. It's a jungle of immense complexity. And yet, we imagine that we can get by with ignoring it. And we do try to get by with ignoring it. There was a time, maybe 150 years ago or so, where psychology was in its early stages, when psychologists were able to think outside the box and were able to dip into other fields other than just the strictly experimental. For example, mysticism and myth and the world of literature, all of these fields which back then a psychologist would have been familiar with and would have dipped into. But now we're far too specialized and we're far too rational, and we're very, very compartmentalized about it. Which isn't a good thing. And I don't see how anyone can argue that it is a good thing. We can't even say that it's scientific, because it isn't scientific, because science has moved on from the end of the 19th century. It's moved on 120 years. So we should move on as well, really. And the interesting thing about moving on in this way, if I can use the word moving on, is that actually what happens then is that we really do start to appreciate the past and what has been said in the past. And we start to appreciate that there is a very profound wisdom in folklore, mythology, and literature and mysticism that is far more profound than anything that's ever coming out of our modern thought. And it's profound not just in some general philosophical way, it's profoundly helpful from a mental health point of view. And we've turned our back on all of that because we've been sold the idea that only the very, very rational is what can help us. And it turns out that rationality cannot help us, not in this field, not in the field of the psyche, because rationality means ignoring the bigger picture in favor of the small area that we are focusing on, which means it's based on ignoring the bigger picture, and that just can't be good, not when it's mental health we're talking about. Health itself, Alan Watts says somewhere, comes from the Old English word hail, as in hale and hearty, which means whole, and so health is wholeness. So being incredibly specialized and only focusing on the rational side of things is as far away from wholeness as it is possible to get. So it's unhealthy, basically. You become very unhealthy in that particular way. So at the moment we have this kind of idea that we're on the cutting edge of science and technology, and any minute now experts are going to prove this, or experts are going to show this, and experts are going to sort it all out. And in part of this viewpoint is also where we rubbish everything that comes before this point, because that was just old-fashioned and stupid, obviously. But when we move on from this obsession with the linear, we're realizing that what humanity has been doing for thousands of years has been relating to the non-linear and finding a way of relating to the non-linear. And that once we see things in this way, we immediately become aware of a huge wealth that is in the old writings or the old stories. And so we don't have to wait for some white-coated expert to make some fantastic discovery in the laboratory that's going to improve our mental health or improve any aspect of our health. Come to that. It's as if humankind has already produced a magnum opus, but we're just not insightful enough or intuitive enough to appreciate that, because we've lost that particular faculty of consciousness, which is the non-literal faculty. We don't have to understand everything in concrete terms, because, as I keep on saying, what we can understand in concrete terms is so insignificant a portion of reality as to be practically negligible. It's certainly not going to help us in this regard, and it certainly isn't something we should be putting all of our money on. Okay, thanks for watching.